You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk. Number 521.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station after another incredibly busy week. Not only am I producing and releasing these weekly podcasts to add to my content listing of over 500 in the library, but I've also, but I've also taken it upon myself to start live streaming on YouTube and Facebook 3 times a week during this isolation period too. The end result is that every minute is packed, either with show preparation or delivery. However, I'm going to try and keep it going as best I can. The live streams this week, which are on Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m, have been with the Trail Hunter following his COVID-enforced return from the PCT, Ellie Bishop discussing mental health and how to cope with current times, and an introduction to dehydrators. Current plans for next week's shows include one based on stove porn for all us stovies out there, an interview with author David Linton regarding his new Cicerone press release, The Big Rounds, and a chat with forager and wild food expert Lisa Cutcliffe to tell us what to keep our eyes open for in the hedgerows while we take our permitted daily constitutional in the countryside. However, back to this podcast. This is the first of a 2-part series with Philip Carcia. A name may be unfamiliar in the UK, but in the US, he's known for completing the AT, the PCT, the Long Trail, the JMT, the Colorado Trail, and several other iconic long-distance routes. His biggest success has come in the last year, when he climbed all 48 4,000 footers in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, start to finish, in every month for 12 consecutive months, completing one of the most grueling and obscure peak bagging projects in the United States, known as the single-year grid. Now, to cap it all, he started and finished the grid with a diaritissima. And a diaritissima is a through hike of all 48 mountains as one continuous route, some 240 miles, 75,000 feet of ascent, in 8 days, 7 hours and 40 minutes. As you can see, it was a huge project, and Philip was good enough to give me 2 hours of his time to go into great depths about his love for the White Mountains, long-distance hiking, and the single-year grid in particular.
Yeah, so my name is Philip Carcia, and currently living in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The White Mountains, for me, are a place that I feel deeply connected to. The White Mountains, for me, are a place that I, for many, many years, came to and cut my teeth when I first started to hike, when I first started to backpack, when I first started to make all of these mistakes that one usually makes when they first start spending time in the outdoors. So on a personal level, the White Mountains are very, very meaningful for me. In terms of their place in New England, in the New England outdoor community, the New England peak bagging community, I mean, they are just the heart of New Hampshire, the heart of New England. The White Mountains have a reputation not only on the East Coast, but across the entire country. The White Mountains are known for their unbelievably difficult trail network. The very technical nature of the trails up here is something that you hear people, hikers, outdoorsmen, sort of discussing at length. It's very rocky, very, very rooty terrain. The conditions in the White Mountains, not only in the winter but year round, can be unpredictable and volatile, and these peaks, not just the Presidential Range, not just Mount Washington, but these peaks, the high peaks of the White Mountains, they they will happily, take your life during any month of the year. These are mountains that command respect, and these are mountains that are kind of woven into the history of hiking in New England, the history of peak bagging in New England. And when you kind of take a step back from all that and sort of appreciate these peaks, these mountains for what they are in a bigger picture, I think that's the reason why so many people, myself included, I think that's the reason why so many people just keep coming back year after year.
Well, for people listening to this in the UK, to give them an idea, to visualise where it is actually in the vastness that is the United States, it's up in the top right-hand corner. It's very close to Canada, and the White Mountain National Forest covers something like 800,000 acres and contains 6 designated wilderness areas. So,
yes.
So it is a massive landscape of note. And also for people that are interested, there it is also a crossroads area for the Appalachian Trail as well. In fact, where Philip's based is the Notch Hostel, which is very popular, which we'll perhaps come on to a bit later on and talk about some of the people coming through and how they're reflecting on the White Mountains themselves. But the purpose of this conversation is obviously this fascinating and challenging journey that you took during 2018, 2019, where you set yourself this incredible task of climbing 48 peaks every month for 12 months. And
yes, sir.
It is better known as the Grid, I understand.
Yes, sir. Yes, the White Mountain Grid. So just to give you a little bit of context here, in New England, and even more specifically in the White Mountains, we have a very list-based hiking culture. So there's a lot of lists of peaks, of trails that are organized and identified, and it's very common for hikers in this area across the Northeast to go after these lists. And one of the most iconic lists is the White Mountain 48, the 48 peaks in the White Mountains that are above 4,000 feet, and a little bit more complicated, a little bit more difficult version of that list is the White Mountain Grid. And the White Mountain Grid requires a hiker, a peak bagger, to hike all 48 4,000 footers in the White Mountains in every calendar month. Now, generally speaking, people are going out and doing this over the course of many, many years. There's no time frame involved. So, 48 mountains times 12, that's 576 peaks. People are taking years and years and sometimes decades to go out and climb, these 576 peaks because, it's close to 3,000 miles of hiking. It's over 1 million feet of vertical gain. It's a lot of time spent on the trail, especially in the winter months. It gets very, very difficult to get out there. In 2016, a White Mountain pioneer, a very, very well-known mountain endurance athlete, a woman by the name of Sue Johnston, she completed the White Mountain Grid for the first time in a calendar year. So Sue Johnston went out and she started on January 1st, climbed all 48 4,000 footers in January, restarted in February, climbed all 48 4,000 footers in February, restarted in March, so on and so forth. And she completed the White Mountain Grid in a calendar year, 11 months, 26 days to be exact. And at that point in 2016, no one had ever completed the grid in that kind of fashion before, that quickly before. She sort of inadvertently took the fastest known time, or set the fastest known time for the grid in completing the calendar year grid. And when she did that, she kind of reframed what a lot of people thought possible, or what a lot of people thought was possible with the White Mountain Grid. I mean, no one really thought that something like that could be done. Climb 48 peaks in New Hampshire, the highest 48 peaks in New Hampshire every month for 12 months through the winter. It just seemed insane. And so, in terms of wanting to take the grid even further in terms of identifying where the grid was at after Sue sort of left off, and also in reading articles and commentary from the hiking community, from Sue specifically. I kind of realized that there was still a bar to set. There was still a sort of bar to push with the White Mountain grid. I kind of realized that although what Sue did was absolutely incredible, absolutely mind-blowing, like I said, kind of reframed what people thought was possible with the high peaks in the White Mountains. With incredible as that was, there was still room for improvement, so to speak. There was still room to really kind of lower that time. And so what I did, what my project kind of became, was not the calendar year grid, but the single year grid. So I wanted to lower the time that Sue had set by a sizable number, by a few weeks. And what you need to do in order to pull that off is be very, very strategic in terms of when you start, and when you finish. And so, long story short, what I ended up doing was trained all year in 2018 in my home in Massachusetts, central Massachusetts. It's where I grew up. Got in, just the best shape that I possibly could over the course of 7 months. And I went out over the course of, August to July. I climbed all 48 4,000 footers in every month consecutively for 12 months. But in that first month, in August 2018, I climbed all 48 over the last 8 days of August. And in July 2019, my last month of the grid, I climbed all 48 4,000 footers over the first 6.5 days of July. And of course, filled in the 10 months in between, met those marks every month, all 48 4,000 footers in every month in between. And so when I finished on July 7th in 2019 on the top of Mount Moosilauke, which is a peak, just 5 miles up the road from where I'm sitting here talking to you right now, I had a total elapsed time. So from the moment that I stepped foot on the trail, August 23rd, 2018, to the moment I got off the trail, July 7th, 2019, I completed the full grid, the single year grid, in an elapsed time of 10 months and 15 days, which was roughly 5 weeks faster than the 11 months, 26 days that Sue established in 2016.
There's so much to talk about, and there's lots of different areas there that you've mentioned I'd like to just touch on. Firstly, Sue Johnston is not a name that I'm familiar with. Had you spoken to her after she had achieved that? But more importantly, just to give us again a bit more of a flavour, how had she approached the event itself, her challenge? Had she set out to do it within 12 months? And did she come from a adventure racing background, super light, hitting it hard, or was she a casual backpacker?
No, Sue, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm certainly not an expert on her background or her resume, but Sue, to the best of my knowledge, is just a super talented long distance runner. I believe she's won the Hard Rock 100 in Colorado. I hope I'm not misspeaking there, but she's a very accomplished ultra marathon runner, trail runner, and being Vermont based, she has just pioneered so many firsts here in the White Mountains, and she's got just an incredible love and respect and appreciation for the White Mountains. She, has held the winter and the overall time for the 48 4,000 footers. So she's just a white mountain junkie, so to speak.
Okay.
But the cool thing about Sue is, with as passionate as she is, with as talented as she is, she's also a very reluctant celebrity. So, she's not much for the fanfare. She's not much for the interviews or the articles. When she was working on the calendar grid, the only thing that she was really doing was putting the stats up on her website, just a very straightforward list of the peaks that she got on what days and what the mileage and the vertical gain was. But there wasn't much additional context. And really, really interesting story is that in 2016, Sue and I inadvertently sat down at the same dinner table in June. I was going out and doing an overnight hike here in the White Mountains. She was obviously working on the calendar grid. And on the way to the dinner, the gentleman who was driving kind of brought up Sue and brought up the calendar grid and kind of explained what she was doing. And I just kind of, my jaw dropped because it had been something that I had thought of before. And I knew that it was one of the last big undone peak bagging projects in the Northeast United States, this place that is just so saturated where everything's kind of been done. And I was blown away and I didn't say much at that dinner. I just kind of, watched her and mingled with everybody else that was there. But while she was working on her calendar grid, there was not a lot of fanfare. There was not a lot of social media. She was keeping the project, very, very close to her chest. But at the same time, I kind of knew what she was doing when she finished. I mean, it was just an incredible, step forward and an incredible mark for the White Mountain community.
She set the bar, didn't she?
Absolutely. And again, she kind of reframed what people thought was possible with the grid. And for me, someone who kind of had this long distance hiking background, this interest in multi-month projects, this kid who had honestly thought that maybe, I could possibly be the first person to ever complete the grid in a year, to see her do it in the way that she did. And so convincingly, it was just like, oh man, it just kind of lit the fire under me even more to see that was actually possible.
I was going to say, how did it make you feel? Were you sort of inspired, or were you feeling slightly defeated, or thinking, yeah, she's thrown the gauntlet down now, I've really got to get my act together?
Yeah, I guess I definitely don't want to make it seem like it was all just hoots and hollers and like, yeah, Sue. I mean, I was nothing but happy for her and nothing but excited for the White Mountain community, because again, it was such a step forward. But I had honestly been kind of thinking about taking on the calendar year grid. I'd been thinking that, possibly I could be the person to do the calendar year grid for a little bit of time leading up to that. So there was absolutely this little sense of deflation and a sense of questioning, like, this is a year-long project. This is something that you're going to have to put money away for a long time to make sure that you have the free time and you can support yourself to hike in the kind of capacity, the full-time capacity that you'll need to. It kind of made me question, like, is this the path for me? Is this the path that I want to go down now that it's already been proven, that it can be done. And like I said, so convincingly. And it wasn't until I started to kind of read more about her journey and her experience after the fact through just her blog a little bit, some reflections that she wrote, but also there were some articles that came out. It wasn't until I kind of read that stuff and then also, read her commentary, literally explaining how someone could come along and lower her time, because she was very vocal about the fact that, she wanted to complete the calendar year grid. She wanted to be the first person to hike the grid in under a year. It was never her intention to set a fastest known time. She was never pursuing this big FKT title. That all came inadvertently afterwards, because no one else had completed the grid in a year. And that's actually a big reason why I in the interviews that I do and what have you, I try to reiterate that, when I came along afterwards, yes, of course, I did lower her time and I do hold, the quote unquote fastest known time for the grid, but I genuinely don't feel like, I took anything from her. I don't feel like I took a record from her. Our experiences, regardless of how similar they were also quite different. And it's just lot of respect and admiration for that woman and how what she did ultimately put me on my path.
Well, I think that's fair enough. I mean, there's two different things here. There's time element, as you say. If you're driven by lists, or you're in a hiking community where people are very enthusiastic to talk about lists and times, then obviously that becomes more important. But there's obviously the enjoying the journey as well, which is another aspect of being in the mountains wherever you are in the world.
Yes.
So let's move on to after you had this obviously inspiration from Sue. You said you started your training. So what does your training consist of then? I presume, and I've looked at the video clip, which I'll also put in the show notes, where
Cool.
I think the local TV station covered your event, or covered the completion of it. You look as if you approached it exactly the same way, really, very, very similar on an ultra runner basis as regards equipment. So when you said you referred to your training, was your training literally hammering up and down the trails as much as possible to get your body used to the inclines?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's kind of the the expected or the assumed answer these days. You know, when people ask like, "Oh, how do you train for this?" Or, you know, what kind of training did you do? Well, in my world, and, you know, based on my experience, there's no better way to train for long distance hiking than to hike long distances. And you know, you'll hear a lot of people in the hiking community, a lot of accomplished people in the hiking community share that same sentiment. So my goal was to basically just get my body used to doing what I saw my body, you know, having to do in the grid for an entire year. And that was to get up and down really rocky, really rooty, really technical mountains in an efficient manner. And so I grew up in central Massachusetts, you know, the quote unquote flatlands of central Massachusetts, very little topography out there. To train for the grid specifically, I climbed, you know, my you know, quote unquote hometown, my quote unquote backyard mountain, Mount Wachusett, 300 times between January 1st and August 1st. Mount Wachusett is a small little peak. It's 2,000 feet above sea level. One trip up to the summit, depending on which trailhead you leave from, you know, is going to get you like 800 feet of vertical, 1,000 feet of vertical. But I just found myself in this absolutely fanatical, obsessive training mindset where I was going out before work, I was going out after work, I was hiking the mountain 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, up to 12 times in a single session. Really just trying to like prepare myself on a physical level for the jarring ascents and descents that were going to be coming, you know, not only during the single year grid, but those first and those last rounds. I mean, just the aggressive nature of the hiking that was to take place during those first and those last rounds. You know, the 6-day traverse and 8-day traverse of the 48. I mean, that's pretty difficult hiking. So I wanted to get my body used to that. I wanted to work out any kinks, any kind of like nagging injuries, and probably equally as important, you know, those 300 summits. Yes, it's cool. It's getting you stronger, but that's also like a lot of time out on the trail in your own head. And this was also very, very important to me, because what that was is it was time for me, or an opportunity for me to pre-visualize my entire experience. So I spent so many mornings out there in the dark, in the cold, on Mount Wachusett, you know, in Massachusetts, by myself, headphones in, and, you know, all of a sudden, you know, in one step, it's like I'm on Mount Wachusett heading up, you know, to this hometown summit. And in the next step in my mind, it's like I'm out in the largest wilderness area in the White Mountains, the Pemigewasset, by myself, heading out to Owl's Head, you know, in my mind, you know, feeling very isolated in my mind, you know, kind of envisioning the hardships that I'm going to be facing, envisioning the things that I'm going to need to tell myself to work through those moments where you don't want to be out there, or you're intimidated to be out there, or you don't quite feel like you have what it takes to step up to the plate on that particular day. So the training was, I tried to make it as well-rounded as possible. I tried to make it equal parts, you know, physical, and equal parts spiritual, and equal parts, you know, emotional and psychological, because the experience of the single year grid, touched on all those things. I mean, it challenged all of those parts of myself, and I knew that was going to be the case right off the jump.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I've had numerous conversations with people when we've discussed great achievements they've done, or trails, or distances, or environment, and they all say that the hardest part is the mental approach, is the mental the mental motivation to keep going, as you say, on days when the weather isn't in your favour and you just don't feel like it, but you've committed to your challenge and you've stuck with it. So fair play on that score. Along with the fitness preparation, obviously, and the mental preparation, which I'm glad you touched on, because that was going to be my next question. Then there's also the financial side as well. Most people, when they do, certainly if I'm speaking to a couple of people at the moment that are coming over to do the PCT, and the biggest part of their decision-making process is how they're going to afford A, the time, and B, the money to be there, but also pay for their home life here, as it will, to make sure that stays stable as well. So from your point of view, I know you moved down to work at the Notch Hostel, which is in the middle of the mountains there, which obviously worked out quite well. But did that job fall in your lap, or was that something you had to work for to try and juggle to get all this together?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting story. I think what most people don't quite realize is that my original plan was to execute the single-year grid exclusively out of the back of my 1999 Ford Ranger. I thought I was going to be living at trailheads through the winter, year round, maybe slipping back down to Massachusetts to kind of get under a roof and what have you with some family. But I thought I was going to be basically living on the road and on the trail during this entire experience. In retrospect, I am very, very thankful that that is not what ended up happening. Just the amount of snow and the precipitation and the rain last year in the White Mountains, it would have been impossible to stay sane in that kind of a scenario. So what ended up happening was, and this is kind of indicative of what started to happen throughout the entire single year grid experience. The universe just kind of, cracked a door of opportunity ever so slightly, just enough for me to kind of poke my nose in and open it a little bit wider. So, a week before I started the single year grid, I was on the internet late one night, just on Facebook, kind of cruising, and the Notch Hostel pops up in my feed. And they are looking for a shuttle driver, housekeeper, front desk guy, jack of all trades, in exchange for a place to stay on their property. In a tiny house on the back of their property. Their property is located, like I said earlier, 5 miles from the Appalachian Trail in the heart of the White Mountain National Forest. So, I mean, even though I had saved for 3 years leading up to the single year grid, even though I had pinched pennies for years leading up to the single year grid, it struck me as an opportunity that I could not turn down. Just to be in a hostel with like-minded people, having the capacity to have a warm, safe place in a central location to come back to, at the end of a long day. Yes, I'd have to be working during the project. That's not what I expected. That's not what I planned for. Yes, I'd be, responsible for things that I didn't quite anticipate, being responsible for in addition to this massive project. But again, it was an opportunity that I couldn't turn down. I came in, I met with Serena, the owner of the Notch Hostel in North Woodstock. And she heard my plans, and she literally handed me a calendar, and she said, "Show me how you're going to do this. Like I'll give you 3 or 4 days off a week. You can work your entire week in just a couple of days, but like, show me how you think you can climb 48 mountains every month and still hold down your responsibilities." And like, to her credit, she heard me out, and she let me say my piece and tell her that I was willing to, hike in all different kinds of weather at all hours of the night, all hours of the morning, in order to make this goal happen. And, again, to her credit, I mean, she really went out on a limb and, ended up hiring me. And I think, also kind of like respected what I was trying to do, and felt like, she wanted to be a part of that. She wanted her business to be a part of that. And, I've said this many times in many interviews. I've said this to her at length, but there is absolutely no way on the planet that I would have been able to pull off the single year grid without the Notch Hostel. I mean, this was an employment situation that became something just so much bigger. I mean, the community here, the thru hikers that come through, the peak baggers that come through, everybody is just so enthusiastic, so stoked. When people would kind of find out what I was doing or hear whispers or hear rumors about what I was doing, they would just fire me up and show me so much love and positivity. And it's just the environment that was curated here during the single year grid was just a huge part of my success, man. It's just a really amazing thing that kind of transpired.
I hope you're enjoying this podcast and you found time over the last 15 years to listen to the many stories, interviews and experiences I've shared within the massive free library of over 500 podcasts, all of which are still available on the various listening platforms. If you've enjoyed the content and it's been useful to you, perhaps helped you develop confidence, skills and outdoor knowledge, and you feel you'd like to support me in some way, you now can using the Ko-fi or Patreon platform. With Ko-fi, you can simply buy me a one-off coffee and leave a note. Patreon is for those who would like to make a more regular donation to help support the station. Links to both can now be found on the front page at theoutdoorstation.co.uk. Looking at the pictures of the hostel at the moment on the internet as you're talking, I'm trying to visualise what the community must have been like or must be like when the hikers all come through and gather. And certainly the way you're talking, it was obviously absolute perfection and timing in the universe that you got the job there. And as you rightly say, being surrounded by like-minded people that weren't distracting you from your target and being very supportive must have been a key part of the success.
Yeah, I mean, I came up to North Woodstock. I've been coming to the White Mountains almost my entire life, over 15 years, but I don't have, or I didn't have any friends, any real connections or contacts in the White Mountains when I moved up here in August 2018. And I mean, it just felt like the entire community opened up as soon as I started working, as soon as I sort of arrived on the scene, so to speak. And that was very helpful from a morale standpoint, obviously, like having these people, around me, constantly, showing me support and positivity and constantly out hiking themselves and being able to exchange ideas and information and beta on the conditions. But also just from like a practical and logistical standpoint, it was super beneficial because, a lot of these big traverses, these 6, 7, 8 peak traverses, a lot of this stuff is point to point. And so you're constantly in a situation, or, you're constantly kind of like trying to be strategic in the sense that, you want to go out and hike these mountains as efficiently as you possibly can. And so a lot of the times what that calls for is point-to-point traverses where you need a car waiting at the other end, or you need somebody waiting at the other end. And again, coming up here with no contacts, no friends, no family, without having the hostel in place, without, being able to, go to work in the evening and make these connections with people who are walking through the door, or regular guests who you've gotten to know over the course of, many months, without having those connections, those hands to offer, hey, I got you on this ride, on Thursday, or, hey, I'm actually headed out to the presidentials as well. I can probably, pick you up on my way back home. I mean, it just, it would have been so much more difficult, the logistics and the strategy and the practicality of getting all these peaks in. It just would have been so much more complex, so much more difficult. I found myself leaning on the Notch Hostel community, and I absolutely found myself leaning on the White Mountain community quite a bit on a very, very consistent basis throughout the course of this entire project. It was just, really, really wonderful.
Talking of logistics, then, I am guessing, and if you can help me out here and obviously describe it for the UK listeners, but I'm guessing that on some occasions, on possibly many occasions, to fit it in around the work and also within the community and the support you had there, you weren't wandering out the door after a nice breakfast at sort of 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. You were kicking off 1, 2, 3 a.m., I guess, and hopefully finding various people to drop you off or collect you, as the case may be. But the other thing I'd like to just explain and describe as best you can, I have the impression that the trails that you're referring to that crisscross the White Mountains are marked trails, that is the way the mountains are managed by the appropriate authorities. Am I right in that? We're not talking about bushwhacking across open country, are we?
No. We're not talking about bushwhacking, although there is a huge bushwhacking culture, not only in the White Mountains, but in New England peak bagging for sure. And when you talk about a route like the Diretissima, when you talk about, through hiking the 48, trying to create the most direct route between the 48 4,000 footers, then you start to incorporate a lot more bushwhacking. But I mean, these are some of the oldest trails in the country. For all intents and purposes, they are very well marked, very well mapped. And for that reason, just quite lovely to navigate, unless of course you're up against some difficult conditions, which is very, very common again in this part of the country.
Okay, well, let's actually walk onto the trail itself. We've been talking for a while about the background to this, and actually let's talk about some of the hikes. Now, just to remind people again, what we're talking about here is 48 peaks every month, and the Diretissima is where it is one continual through hike of 240 miles, give or take, linking all 48 peaks together in one go. Now, what Philip did was start and finish the challenge, if you like, with a Diretissima. So he did all 240 miles, 48 peaks on the first date, and finished with exactly the same thing on the latter date. And obviously we'll come on to how he filled the rest of the time in those 12 months. As it were. But certainly, if you could give us an idea of what the weather was like that first Diretissima, how you were feeling, what sort of preparation you'd done for yourself as regards when you hit the trail itself, and if you had any crew with you at all, any support friends or other people from the community that were giving you some motivation as you did that first Diretissima.
Yeah, well, I will give you a little bit of additional context just so your listeners can get the full picture here. So I completed the White Mountain Diretissima. That is a through hike of the 48 4,000 footers, one continuous route across the 48 4,000 footers in the first month and the last month of the single year grid. So the two very, very fast traverses were done in the form of White Mountain Diretissimas. Now, that was very intentional for a specific reason, because the White Mountain Diretissima, in my mind, represents probably the most difficult, least efficient way to hike all 48. And in those two particular months, August and July, the only 2 months where I had any influence over the elapsed time of the project, the overall elapsed time of the project, the only 2 months really where I should have been trying to hike these mountains as efficiently as possible. Again, I was doing the opposite, and that was very important to me because this whole project was about going to the mountains that I love, the mountains that I cut my teeth on, and giving myself fully every single day, not cutting corners, making it as difficult as humanly possible, truly having to step up to the plate if I wanted to hit every mark that I was trying to hit. So again, in that first month and that last month, in these 2 months where, it's in my best interest to be, hiking these peaks in the most efficient manner, I was doing the opposite. I chose to take on the White Mountain Direttissima, which in my mind, again, is the most difficult, least efficient way to complete the 48. And the first Direttissima that I hiked in August 2018, this was completed in a primarily unsupported status. So I started the trail with 8 days worth of food, all of my gear, all of my supplies. The intention was to make it the full 220 miles without a resupply, without any outside intervention. Kind of a long story in terms of what happened on that hike. Ultimately, I did not get the unsupported superlative, and that is because my hiking partner, Andrew Soares, who is another very, very accomplished White Mountain hiker. My hiking partner ended up having to drop out. His knee basically swelled up to the size of a grapefruit, and he had to drop out of the hike. And the unsupported rules state very clearly that unsupported is unaccompanied unless you begin and end with a single partner. And so just his act of leaving the hike, kind of disrupted my unsupported status. So the first Direttissima, the end of August, beautiful weather, really, really lovely, dry trail, completed that in 8 days and I think 8-ish hours. In what I'm kind of referring to as a self-supported style. And then the last Direttissima, July 2019. So the second Direttissima that I completed as part of the single year grid. This was 6 days, 18 hours. I hiked this route in the opposite direction. So I was headed, north to south, effectively, back the way that I came, on the first Direttissima. And this was a very, very interesting point in the project because on July 1st at midnight, it was in my best interest to be at the trailhead, to be at the starting point of the first peak, and leaving in the middle of the night, leaving as soon as I possibly could, which was at midnight on the 1st of July, and getting through those 48 peaks as quickly as I could. And so kind of feeling like I had already done, I've done so much backpacking in my life and had certainly already done the self-supported, unsupported style on the Direttissima the first go around. I decided to get a crew in place for this last round of the single year grid, the second Direttissima. I got a full support crew in place, basically had a partner with me 90% of the time on the trail, had friends and family meeting at nearly every single road crossing with, big meals and water and supplies and gear and a place to crash and, anything that you could possibly need just to, take a few minutes off and keep yourself going. And, this kind of allowed me to take on, just more of a trail runner, ultra marathon runner style, just traveling extremely light. The Direttissima route was so dialed in my mind at that point, one, because I had completed the route, less than a year prior, but also I'd been back on the route so much during the single year grid. I just wanted to, like I said, as soon as midnight hit on July 1st, hit the ground running. And that's effectively what I did. And, for all intents and purposes, again, that first week of July 2019, the second Direttissima, lovely weather, a little warm during the day. It does get hot in the Northeast, even at elevation and in the dog days of summer. So a little warm during the day, definitely because we had such a wet spring and such a wet winter. It was definitely pretty buggy out there. And we were traveling, very, very, very long miles. We were traveling for long periods of time without sleep, just in the spirit of like, man, I'm almost a year into this insane project. I can't believe that I made it this far. Let's just get this thing done. Let's just drive ourselves into the ground here and get this thing done. And so I was able to, I was very lucky to be able to complete that second Direttissima in a span of just under 7 days. I think it was 6 days, 18 hours in a supported fashion. And yeah, ultimately, when I finished that hike, that last round, I also brought to conclusion the single year grid, and on the same day, finished the White Mountain Diretissima in a time of 6 days, 18 hours, and finished the single year grid in a time of roughly 10 months, 15 days. And let me tell you, man, I mean, it's for anybody who's listening, who's started and completed a journey that is bigger than themselves. It's just, reaching that trailhead, finishing the Diretissima, finishing the single year grid, lowering this time, knowing that I gave myself fully. I mean, that's, 6-7 months out. That's still something I'm trying to process. That's still something I'm trying to come to terms with to a certain degree, because as insane as the project was, as much of a disruption to my life, so to speak, as this project was, by the time I reached July, really climbing all 4,000 footers every month just also felt to a certain degree like this incredible life practice, like this kind of this everyday thing that was really hard, but that I was committed to. It was veiled with an air of normalcy by the end, and that was a pretty powerful thing. And
it takes a while to break out of, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
Just coming back to the Diretissima then, again, could you help visualize the listeners? The impression that I have listening to you is that when you started with the 8 days worth of food, were you camping, or were you just running or working your way through that? Because I'm assuming from the video clip that I saw that the last Diretissima, as you say, and you had a sort of support crews, etc., that was more on an ultra runner type basis. You were literally going on a few hours sleep and presumably sleeping in the back of a car when you got to a trailhead. But what were you doing on the first Diretissima then? Were you camping? Did you take all the equipment with you? So ultimately the question is, how much were you carrying? What was the weight?
Base weight for me was I would say 9 pounds, low 9 pounds. And total weight with 8 days worth of food was just over 30 pounds. Because you're projecting eight days out there, and, that kind of pace is upwards of 30 miles a day. And, with all due respect, 30 miles a day on something like the PCT or something like the Colorado Trail, or these very finely groomed Western trails with a lot of, switchbacks and a really nice tread. I mean, just very different than 30 miles a day in the White Mountains, especially, with that kind of weight on your backpack, or weight on your back. And so, yes, for the first Diretissima was a full-on through hiking experience. I mean, we had, my buddy and Andrew and I were both completely self-contained. We had all of our own food, all of our own gear. We were not sharing a single thing. We weren't even sharing ibuprofen. And it was just a full-on through hike, and there was no running. I mean, there was no running, with that kind of weight, and certainly with that kind of weight over that kind of terrain. It is just impossibly rocky, impossibly rooty. It is so slow going at times that, to try to run through some of that stuff, especially with a backpack, it just would be so impractical and probably put you at more risk for injury. So the first Diretissima, it was truly a through hike of the White Mountain 48. That's what I refer to it as. It was a through hike of the White Mountain 48. We each had our own kit that was self-contained. We had our own food. We were sleeping. A lot of the times we were sleeping on summits. We were just, cowboy camping, bivvying out on summits because, the first round we were, even though we were backpacking, even though we were hiking, we were still very sleep deprived. I mean, to get those 30 miles in, you're going 15, 16, 17, 18, sometimes hours a day. And sometimes the best thing to do is just, you get up to a summit, you get another one off the list, and you need a couple hours of sleep. Weather's good. Just throw down your sleeping bag and your pad and just, find a non-impactful place to camp and just kind of, catch a few winks. And And so that's what we were doing. We were moving like through hikers out there, and it felt like a through hike. It felt like a through hike of the 48. A lot of the Diarrhytissima, or I would say a respectable percentage. You're on the Appalachian Trail, or you're crossing the Appalachian Trail. So, it felt like just this unbelievably challenging backpacking trip, but also in the greater context of like, oh my God, this is round one of 12 rounds, of the 48. It was just, again, kind of hard to process, kind of hard to wrap my mind around the whole thing.
Okay, so sandwiched in between the two Diarrhytissimas were another 10 months worth of peak bagging. Now, can you give us an idea of how you approached it on a monthly basis? Presumably, what were you getting? 2 days off a week or 3 days off every 2 weeks, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, with the schedule at the hostel, was variable because we go into different periods of, we're busier during certain months and then we're much more relaxed during other months. So the amount of hours that I was juggling at the Notch hostel during the project varied from month to month. But just the fact that I was responsible for this job, just the fact that I was responsible to be at the front desk to help run this business, that added to the strategic nature of the project, because there are more moving parts. So in terms of like a day-to-day or weekly kind of itinerary or schedule, for me, as soon as the first of the month hit, I was looking for a weather window in the presidential range specifically. So this is some of the highest peaks in the White Mountains. The presidential range is home to Mount Washington. Mount Washington at one point had the highest recorded wind speed on the planet. Very, very difficult, tumultuous range of mountains in the Whites, and is capable of producing just the most insane weather on the planet. And so as soon as the first hit, especially in the winter months where it was even more difficult, and or deadly in the presidential range, as soon as the first hit, I was looking for a good weather window in the presidential range and my free time to kind of, a free time at the Notch hostel to align so that I could get a full traverse of Mount Washington in the presidential range, because I felt like every month, regardless of what part of the year, that was the crux traverse. There's 7 or 8 peaks that you can get on the traverse. You're above tree line at 5,000 or 6,000 feet for miles and miles and miles. The terrain is very rocky, very rooty, surprise, surprise, very slow going, difficult to move fast. So this was priority number one for me every single month. As soon as the presidentials were done, I could kind of move to other parts of the White Mountains, other like what I considered problem areas of the White Mountains, whether it's just like difficult terrain or a far more remote drive or an area that was kind of like operating in its own microclimate. The Whites have microclimates where it's like there's just some 4,000 footers that get way more snow than others. And so, I would kind of try to systematically identify the challenges outside of the presidential range once I had gotten that traverse in every month. But it was a very strategic kind of project. I mean, it just required so much strategy. It required me to really kind of fine tune how long it would take me to get to these mountains. It would require me to kind of, there were certain ranges in September, October, November, where I could just go out and, 18 miles, 4,000 footers, for the effort to reward ratio. That's incredible. You're getting a lot of work done. It's a long day, but you're getting a lot of work done. In December, January, February, in that same range, this is the Carter Mariah Traverse, for those of you who are familiar with the White Mountains. In that same range, I'd have to drive out 3 separate occasions to go up and down these peaks, split them up in that way, because there was just so much snow in between them, and they were, these trails were just not getting traveled, that it completely rearranged my flow. It completely rearranged my strategy. And so I found myself, always having to be strategic, but also, needing to remain flexible and open, because you just cannot dictate what these mountains do. And, in the winter of 2018, 2019, specifically in the White Mountains, it was really hard to dictate, really hard to predict what these mountains were going to do, because we just got so much snow on, not even a monthly basis, just on a weekly basis. I mean, on so many occasions during that winter, during the winter that I was working on the single year grid, the snowstorms were measured in feet. And I'm having to put in, 48 mountains a month. I'm having to work, during the weekdays on my days off. And I'm having to be out there, by myself, breaking this trail, moving so much slower, again, messing with my strategy, more difficult to determine how long these traverses are going to take you, how much effort is going to be required to get up and down these peaks. I mean, the single year grid, personally speaking, now on the back end, looking back on the project, I think, just by nature, the single year grid was always going to get more difficult before it got any easier. And that was just true throughout the entire project. It was tough on the front end with the diaritissima. And then the winter came very early. I was on snowshoes the last week of October until pretty much all the way into May. I was on solid snow in the White Mountains for close to 8 months, actually over 8 months. And of course, once that snow starts to disappear, then you start dealing with a whole other line of difficulties and different circumstances that have the capacity to mess with your strategy. And again, it just continued to get more and more difficult before it got any easier. And really, the only time that it did get easy, the only time that that weight was kind of like off my shoulders, so to speak, was the day that I finished, because again, these mountains are so unpredictable and they're so tough, and it doesn't matter how much experience you have, doesn't matter how fit you are, it doesn't matter if you've just put in 1,000,000 feet of vertical in a year. Like, these mountains are always tough and they're always, difficult to get across. So, I hope I've kind of painted a little bit of a picture there. It was a project that was in constant flux. And at no point did I ever really think that, at no point was I convinced that I was going to make it all the way until the end, without question, until the end of the project, until the last month, because there were just so many variables. And again, I was driving, a 1999 Ford Ranger around these mountains with the bad inspection sticker. I had saved for 3 years to save up for this project. I was on a very, very tight budget. There were a lot of things that were kind of working against me, in addition to the conditions, in addition to the weather. But at the end of the day, I think just, my personal love and willingness to give myself to these peaks are kind of what ended up being the differentiating factor, so to speak, the reason why I was able to kind of work through that hardship, just because I love these mountains so much, man. It's just like a really amazing place.
So are you saying proportionally then all of your free time, or pretty well all of your free time that you had away from the hostel, as it were, was spent on the mountains?
Yeah, more or less. I made a couple trips down to Massachusetts during the holidays, almost like slept through those, those experiences, because I was just so exhausted. But yes, I mean, my free time primarily was spent either on trail or driving to the trail, because I think that's another thing people don't quite realize is, like, yes, I was living in the White Mountains. I was super, super lucky to be able to have this place at the Notch Hostel, this central location. But I was driving on average probably like 2 hours a day. Not every single day, but I drove quite a bit to and from these trailheads. And when, like I said, some of these ranges got really snowed in and I had to make, 3 trips out to a range per month instead of 1, then I was really spending a lot of time. So it was a combination of things. It was like, okay, when I wasn't hiking, Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of free time in there, but that free time is also spent driving to the trailheads, right? And so then when I'm not driving and hiking, then like, yeah, there's a little bit of free time in there, but then I'm also like up at midnight making, falling asleep while I'm making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the kitchen for the hike the next day, or cooking 2 or 3 pizzas to pack up and go on the hike the next day. So what time wasn't spent on the trail, that didn't necessarily mean that like it wasn't spent on the project, because it was, the difficulties, and I think the reason why, this was so challenging. Yes, of course it's the hiking, but it's like, I was operating on a primarily self-supported kind of basis. I was making my own food every night. I was packing my own backpack. I was replacing my gear. I was sewing my clothes. I was fending for myself, so to speak. That's absolutely not to say that I did not have a lot of gracious people in my corner at the notch or even outside of the notch, really stepping up and helping me out. But like, but at the end of the day, I was the one that needed to hike the miles, and I was the one that needed to make sure that I had enough fuel in my car and fuel in my body to get there. And it was just such a time-consuming effort, Bob.
So tell me, how did you motivate yourself on those bad days when you perhaps had a bad night's sleep? You're tired from whatever reason. The weather isn't looking promising, but you won't know until you get to the trailhead. That you're tired from the peaks you've done previously. How did you motivate yourself on that bad day, those bad mornings when you had to get up at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock and face whatever was going to be ahead of you?
Sure. It's an interesting question, man, and one that I'm still trying to answer, because I tapped into a level of dedication during this project that I had never experienced before, personally in my life. Even, going off and hiking the AT and the PCT, I felt like this required just a little bit more, dedication, a little bit more obsession than those projects. And so when you ask, like, how did you get out there when you didn't want to hike or when the conditions were tough? I think it all comes down to the level of investment. This was not something I just woke up and decided to try to pull off. I had been going to the White Mountains my entire life. I lost my, I speak about this a lot. I lost my father to a very unexpected battle with lung cancer in 2014. In 2015, I climbed all 48 4,000 footers for the first time. Had been coming to this area my entire life, but for the first time that following summer, hiked all 48 4,000 footers for the first time. And for those following 3 years, I was training and reading and plotting and scheming and saving and just really putting my nose to the dirt to try to make this happen. And so there was this level of investment building over the course of those 3 years. And then, January 1st, 2018, I actually start training for the grid. I'm out on Mount Wachusett every single day in the dark, in the rain, in the cold, working my body, pre-visualizing, again, adding to that level of investment and really, like, on a bigger picture, really trying to like foster all of this love, all of this incredible energy that I've sort of built up over my many, many years in the White Mountains, trying to kind of gather all of that and just be ready to go to war, so to speak, when this project kicked off. And so, when you care about a place in that kind of capacity, and when you build that kind of investment over many, many weeks and months and years, I mean, yes, I questioned the entire time, like, am I going to be able to do this? Like, is this my year? Am I the guy? But ultimately, like, no matter how twisted the weather was outside, no matter how sleep deprived I was just so invested, Bob. Like, I was just
committed.
Absolutely. There was a switch that kind of flipped. And I knew that I was willing to go really, really far. I knew that I was willing to go really, really deep to make this happen. And so, man, you know, when the weather was awful, when I was sleep deprived, when I was having issues with my vehicle, which happened on multiple occasions, when the United States government shut down and they were no longer plowing trailheads in the national forest, you know, during one of the worst winters on record, when I just consistently was backed up against the wall, I never really, I was full of self-doubt, but I never really even considered stopping or quitting or not moving forward in the same in the same kind of committed capacity, because I just loved it so much, man, and I wanted this for so long, and you know, it felt like at a certain point, you know, the entire White Mountain community was watching, and that's just like a very powerful experience to go through. You know?
Yeah, I'm sure. What an interesting guy who tells it all with great honesty about what he went through to achieve this feat. My thanks to Philip, of course, for taking the time to talk to me. As I mentioned, there are photos, links and video news clips over on the outdoorstation.co.uk show notes and website. Part 2 starts with the changes that he noticed in himself as we delve deeper into the story of Philip Carcia and the single-year grid. Until next time, folks, take care during this isolation time, and bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear or see more from our extensive free library, please visit theoutdoorstation.co.uk.